jazz is probably the musical art form that is thought to be quasi-synonymous with the concept of improvisation. The immediate creative gesture and the exuberant creativity of jazz performance baffles many listeners and leads them to ask themselves how it is possible for the musicians to create such highly complex and at the same time organized music from the moment, seemingly without any obvious guidelines. In this chapter, I will try to trace the development of the essential elements and organizational principles of jazz music and to find out where the vital and spontaneous improvisational gesture of this music originates. I am formulating the following considerations with a focus on our ongoing investigation and discussion of improvisation. My intention is not to give you a thorough introduction to jazz music as such. That being said, a dedicated part of the course will later deal with the theory and practice of jazz improvisation in more detail. One outstanding characteristic of jazz music is based on the fact that at the beginning of the 20th century a completely new genre of music was created, which was not the mere development of an already existing one. The rapid developmental dynamics of this new music and the global spread enthusiasm and imitation that it triggered made jazz a unique and dazzling phenomenon of modernity. The fact that today improvisation has become a much recognized artistic practice and a desirable skill is partly due to the experience and the impact of jazz. To understand the notion that jazz and improvisation have become virtually synonymous with each other, we need to understand the essential quality and nature of improvisation in jazz music and its tradition. The origins of jazz music as an African-American music are undisputed. The roots of jazz are predominantly to be found in African-American culture, and the most important protagonists of jazz, at least in its first decades, were African-American musicians. The historic development of jazz music took place on American soil, a setting that explains the various cultural and stylistic inflows of the new art form. The very different African and European cultural and musical lines of traditions were meeting with original American developments and combined into a new hybrid idiom, the music that we know as jazz. To understand jazz music, one has to acknowledge the social reality of the USA. The suffocating historical burden of slavery and the prevailing cruel reality of American society, characterized by racism and discrimination, and thus by extreme social and economic inequality. At the same time, jazz music as an African-American art form reflects the awakening of an immense cultural and creative potential and a process of self-empowerment, emancipation, and a manifestation of cultural identity. One can understand the development of jazz music therefore as both a successful process of individual and social emancipation and a process of intercultural mediation. Let us see if we can find evidence of this process in the musical material itself, while maintaining our focus on the phenomenon of improvisation. Put in a simplified way, one can say that the prevailing musical organizing principle of jazz music in its traditional phases up to the 1950s is mostly as follows. The compositions or pieces that are played are usually popular songs, borrowed from the dance, radio or film music of the time.
The promised kiss of springtime that makes the lonely winter sing low. that trembles on the brink of a lovely song. You are the angel glow that lights a star.
When these compositions are performed by the jazz ensemble, they are usually not written down for the performance. They are played by heart. The musicians know the melody, form, and chord progressions. As the pieces are interpreted by the jazz ensemble, the concrete musical aspects such as harmonic and melodic embellishments, voice leading, dynamics, etc. are created ad hoc during the performance. The formal sequence of events is usually song melody or theme played by the ensemble collectively, followed by a previously undefined number of repetitions of the harmonic form, with individual musicians coming to the fore and taking a leading voice, while the remaining musicians accompany them in a supporting manner. At the end of these so-called solo choruses, the theme is played again by the ensemble collective. In this structural arrangement and practice, one can see the representations of society, the popular theme that every musician and every listener knows, community, the band as a cohesive group of like-minded people, the audience as an extension of this group, and the individual, the soloist telling his or her own story. Looked at it this way, the music thus always deals with questions of normative social reality, of social cohesion and communication, and of individual identity and self-expression. In order for this artistic negotiation process to succeed in all its facets and to become possible in the first place, a special kind of procedure of creative interaction is needed. One that allows space and freedom, empathy and self-expression, support and encouragement, but also disagreement and contradiction. And this is exactly what becomes possible through improvisation. As the jazz idiom developed enormously fast within a few decades, it became more and more complex and technically demanding. A successful artistic execution of the spontaneous creative process was only possible if the musicians involved had a very high degree of knowledge, experience, and corresponding instrumental skills. For aspiring young musicians, becoming a jazz musician meant years of intensive training and preparation. Due to its increasing complexity and formalization, and more so due to an increasing commercial appropriation, the music threatened to lose some of its original vitality. As a reaction to this, by the end of the 1950s, younger and some established musicians felt the need to free jazz from its seemingly well-worn path, and also in view of the dramatic increase in racially motivated social tensions in the USA, to make it once again more explicitly a voice of political resistance and social, racial and individual emancipation. These endeavors were by no means understood as a break with the jazz tradition. They were rather intended as a recollection and revival of the original spirit of the music. The resulting new developments, labeled as the new thing, brought in regard with the musical organization and the practice of improvisation an even stronger emphasis on collective interaction and a more expressive exploration of individual possibilities of expression. The accustomed use of familiar standard themes as the musical vehicles that I have already described as representations of social norms was largely abandoned in favor of original compositions, thus representing a higher degree of cultural self-confidence, by an increased emphasis on collective ensemble play, the community that is, and in favor of extended soloistic explorations of individual self-expression. Another important movement away from the established notions of jazz and towards a new contemporary definition of African American music was initiated by the founding of the musicians collective AACM, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, in Chicago. Note the absence of the word jazz. As many once progressive aspects of jazz seem to contain and reproduce elements of racial disempowerment, a new generation of African American musicians was underway to redefine American and global music once again. Musician and scholar George Lewis has written and published a profound documentation of these developments under the title A Power Stronger Than Itself, the AACM and American Experimental Music. In my opinion, the 1960s and 70s were a very experimental and fruitful time for jazz and various new musical directions that developed out of it. In addition to the renewal movements just outlined, there were also numerous attempts to fuse jazz with other forms of music, such as rock or national music traditions, especially in European countries. I will talk about this in the next chapter on improvised music. In the past 2 decades of the 20th century, jazz was globally established as a contemporary art form, but at the same time facing a decreasing popularity compared with previous decades. Successful attempts have been undertaken to preserve the status of jazz music and guarantee its future through institutionalization. jazz at New York Lincoln Center, and the founding of numerous jazz study programs around the world are the most obvious results. While representing success stories on one hand, these developments are also controversial to some in the sense that they are accompanied by a rather conservative canonization of what jazz is or should be. In my opinion, jazz is both a contemporary classical music of African American origin and at the same time a vital resource, inspiration, and ever-changing vehicle for new musical developments. While there can be no doubt about the fact that the golden era of jazz is in the past, the music once labeled as jazz remains a solitary phenomenon representing high art and popular approachability, protest and affirmation, emancipation and tolerance, individualization and collectivity. Many musics of today are still inspired or influenced by the jazz tradition, and the practice of collective improvisation as developed and performed in the best examples of jazz music is being recognized as a paradigm for creative human interaction that radiates far beyond the boundaries of the idiom. As mentioned before, we are going to dedicate a whole course part to jazz improvisation that will also look into the more practical aspects of it. As always, please listen to the audio podcast to this chapter. Our next chapter will be about improvised music. Thank you and see you there.